There is a ruin in Yorkshire that dwarfs most intact cathedrals. Its nave stretches 300 feet through open air, its arches frame nothing but sky, and its cellarium, a vaulted undercroft running 300 feet beneath what was once the largest dormitory in England, still stands with the kind of engineering precision that makes modern architects fall silent. Walk through it today, and the 19 stone pillars hold up a ceiling that has survived nearly 9 centuries of weather, dissolution, industrial stripping, and neglect. The spaces between the stones are now home to 8 species of bat. Where lay brothers once ate their silent meals on wooden benches, visitors now aim phone cameras upward and try to capture in a photograph what the medieval builders achieved with limestone and faith and unpaid labour. 500,000 people visit Fountains Abbey every year. They walk through the water gardens, photograph the tower rising above the tree line, and read the plaques explaining that this was once the richest Cistercian monastery in England. What the plaques tend not to explain is how it got that way, what it cost the men who built it, or what kind of person looked at 400 years of sacred architecture and decided it would make an excellent garden ornament. Because the story of Fountains Abbey is not really about monks seeking God in a Yorkshire valley. It is about what happens when purity becomes wealth, when wealth becomes power, and when power is finally stripped away by a king who needed the money, a merchant who wanted the lead, and a disgraced politician who saw in the bones of a dead monastery the most beautiful thing he would ever own. Historic England describes it as the best preserved of English abbeys and the finest picturesque ruin. And for once the official description is not an exaggeration. The majority of the buildings visible today were constructed between 1170 and 1247, with significant additions in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. The Abbey Church, the Chapter House, the Refectory, the Lay Brothers' Dormitory, the guest houses, the Abbey Mill, and the bridges across the Skell all survive in some form. This is the story of Britain's most famous ruin. And like all the properties in this series, the beauty is real. And the cost of that beauty is something the guidebook would rather you did not think about too carefully. It began with a riot. In the autumn of 1132, 13 monks were expelled from St. Mary's Abbey in York after a dispute that had been building for months. To understand what happened, you need to understand what St. Mary's was. It was not some quiet country priory. It was one of the richest Benedictine houses in the north of England, sitting inside the walls of York, endowed with extensive lands and political connections that reached to the crown itself. Its monks were comfortable. The daily offices were observed, but loosely. The food was good. The wine was better. The accommodations were superior to anything most men in 12th century Yorkshire could dream of, and within that comfort, a group of 13 began to feel the weight of something they could only call shame. They did not want more, they wanted less. They wanted to go back to the original Benedictine rule as it had been written in the 6th century by Saint Benedict of Nursia, before wealth and political influence had softened monasticism into something closer to a gentleman's club than a religious discipline. The rule was clear. Monks should live by the work of their hands. They should own nothing. They should sleep in dormitories, not private chambers. They should eat simply, dress simply, and devote themselves to prayer and manual labour in equal measure. At St. Mary's, these principles had become suggestions rather than commandments, and the 13 dissenters could no longer pretend otherwise. The prior, a man named Richard, became their leader. Among the group was a monk named Robert, who would later be canonized as Saint Robert of Newminster. When word of the dispute reached Thurston, the Archbishop of York, he agreed to visit the abbey on the 9th of October 1132 to mediate. The meeting was a disaster. The abbot, a man named Geoffrey, had spent weeks trying to force the dissenters back into line using threats, bribes, and every kind of institutional pressure available to a medieval religious superior. When the Archbishop arrived and it became clear that the 13 were not going to submit, the meeting collapsed into open violence. The contemporary chronicle records that the abbot did his utmost by force, threat, entreaty, and other means to persuade them to return. 2 of the original group broke under the pressure and went back. One of them, a monk called Gervase, later changed his mind again and rejoined the dissenters. The other, a monk called Ralph, stayed at St. Mary's and was described in the record with a phrase that has survived 9 centuries. He made terms with his flesh and his belly clave to the ground. It is one of the most devastating character assessments in English monastic history. Ralph chose comfort over conviction. The remaining 13 were expelled. Thurston took them into his protection and hosted them for nearly 3 months while the abbot of St. Mary's continued to agitate for their return. Then, on Christmas Day, 1132, the 13 monks sat down to dinner with the Archbishop at Ripon. The next morning, the feast of St. Stephen, traditionally associated with new beginnings and acts of charity, Thurston led them along the valley of the River Skell to a strip of enclosed ground about 3 miles southwest of the city. What he gave them was described at the time as a place of horror and vast solitude, uninhabited for all the centuries back, thick set with thorns, and fit rather to be the lair of wild beasts than the home of human beings. It was midwinter. The trees were bare. The ground was frozen. The valley of the Skell was narrow, steep-sided, and dark, but it had what the monks needed: 6 natural springs that would supply fresh water year-round, enough timber for shelter, stone for eventual construction, and the river itself, which would provide power for mills, drainage for latrines, and a natural boundary between the sacred and the secular. They named it Fountains, either for those springs or as a tribute to their mother house at Clairvaux in Burgundy, whose founder was Bernard de Fontaine. Richard was elected as the first abbot on the 27th of December, and the community began its experiment in holy poverty. Their first buildings were crude wooden shelters, probably 2 stories high and barely weatherproof. They had almost nothing: no endowment, no wealthy patron, no guarantee of survival. Archbishop Thurston had given them 260 acres at Sutton, north of the site, and another 200 acres at Hurleshoe, but these were not Thurston's personal lands. They belonged to the diocese, and he could give no more. The monks were on their own. Their first winter was brutal. The Chronicle records 2 years of privation and poverty so severe that the community seriously considered abandoning England entirely and seeking refuge with Cistercian houses on the continent. They were starving. They were freezing. The wood they cut for fuel was green and smoked terribly. The shelters leaked. Illness spread through the group. They were, by any objective measure, failing. What saved them was money, and the man who brought it was Hugh, the former dean of York Minster. Hugh was not a young idealist. He was a rich man with a considerable fortune, and when he arrived at Fountains, he brought not just his wealth, but furniture, books, to start the Abbey's library, and the kind of administrative competence that comes from running one of the most important religious institutions in the north of England. 2 canons from York followed shortly after, a man named Serlo and another named Tosti, and they too brought money. The monks who had fled luxury to find God discovered rather quickly that God's work required exactly the kind of resources they had left behind. By 1135, King Stephen had confirmed all their possessions. Fountains had formally joined the Cistercian order, and the community had placed itself under the authority of Clairvaux Abbey in Burgundy, which was under the rule of the great reformer Saint Bernard. A monk named Geoffrey of Ainay was sent from Clairvaux to teach the English community how to celebrate the 7 canonical hours according to Cistercian usage, how to build in the Cistercian style, and how to organize a monastery that could sustain itself through its own labor. Geoffrey brought with him not just knowledge, but a blueprint. The Cistercian order had been growing rapidly since the end of the previous century, and by the beginning of the 13th century would have more than 500 houses across Europe. Fountains became the second Cistercian house in northern England, after Rievaulx Abbey. The transformation from desperate outcasts huddling in a frozen valley to a functioning, internationally connected monastery had taken less than 3 years. It was an extraordinary achievement. It was also the beginning of a contradiction that would define the Abbey for the next 400 years. The Cistercian order's genius was not spiritual, it was economic. While other monastic orders relied on donations, rents, and the income from parish churches, the Cistercians had developed a system that turned remote, supposedly worthless land into productive enterprise on an industrial scale. The principle was simple: reject the world, then quietly conquer it through agriculture. And the engine of that system was the lay brother. Lay brothers, known in Latin as conversi, were not monks. They did not take full monastic vows. They attended fewer services. They could not read. They could not write. Many of them came from the peasant class and had no education whatsoever. What they had was the ability to work, and work is what they did. From before dawn until after dark, every day of their lives except Sundays and the most important feast days, they farmed. They herded sheep. They mined lead. They quarried stone. They tanned leather. They forged iron. They bred horses. They served as masons, tanners, shoemakers, and smiths. They were the invisible workforce that made the entire Cistercian experiment possible. And at Fountains, their contribution was so vast that the Abbey built the largest lay brothers' quarters in England to house them. The system rested on a theological foundation that justified the inequality at its core. The rule of Saint Benedict made a clear distinction between the life of the spirit and the life of the body. Idleness is the enemy of the soul, Benedict wrote. Therefore, the brethren should be occupied at certain times in manual labour and at other times in sacred reading. In practice, this meant that the choir monks devoted themselves to the liturgy of the hours, rising before dawn for matins and moving through 7 further offices before compline at nightfall. Their physical labour was limited and largely symbolic. The real work was delegated to the lay brothers, who were classified as a lower order within the community. They could not vote in chapter meetings. They could not become abbot. They could not access the choir or the eastern range of the cloister. They were, in every meaningful sense, a servant class within a religious institution that claimed to reject worldly hierarchies. The monks, who had fled St. Mary's because they believed the Benedictine rule had been corrupted by wealth, had created a system in which a permanent underclass of silent, illiterate workers sustained their own spiritual practice. Whether the lay brothers considered this a fair exchange is not recorded. Their voices, like their names, do not appear in the Abbey's chronicles. The cellarium is the building that visitors remember most. It runs 300 feet along the western side of the cloister, a vaulted tunnel of stone supported by 19 pillars. And in the medieval period, it was divided into 5 separate rooms by screens and wooden partitions. The northern rooms served as storerooms and cellars under the supervision of the cellarer, the monk responsible for provisioning the entire community. The southern rooms were the lay brothers' refectory, where they ate their meals in total silence while a reader intoned passages from scripture. Above the cellarium was the dormitory, stretching the full 300 feet, where up to 140 lay brothers slept on straw mattresses that were changed once a year. At the building's southwest corner, the latrines were built over the swiftly flowing river Skell, an arrangement that was practical, efficient, and entirely characteristic of the Cistercian approach to sanitation and human dignity. The lay brothers' daily rhythm was relentless. They rose before dawn for a simplified version of the night office, then worked through the morning until a brief midday prayer. The afternoon was devoted to more physical labour, and the day ended with compline and the great silence. They ate in silence. They were forbidden from speaking to the choir monks except through designated intermediaries. They could not leave the abbey grounds without permission. They had no property, no wages, no family. In return for this life of obedience and backbreaking work, they received food, shelter, a wool habit, and the promise of salvation. The choir monks, meanwhile, followed a more rigorous schedule of prayer, rising at 2 or 3 in the morning for matins and moving through 7 further offices before compline at nightfall. But it was the lay brothers who produced the wealth. It was always the lay brothers. The abbey could not have existed for a single year without them, and their names were never recorded. The physical layout of the abbey reflected this hierarchy with brutal precision. The choir monks occupied the eastern range of the cloister, with their dormitory above the chapter house and their infirmary to the east. They slept in a long room with 2 rows of beds running from end to end, like a ward in a hospital, on mattresses of straw stuffed into blue linen, ticking. At Durham, the custom was to carry a dead brother's blue bed to his funeral and hold it as a canopy over the grave, so that every night, when a monk lay down to rest, he was reminded of his last sleep. Whether Fountains followed this particular custom is not recorded, but the principle was the same across the Cistercian order. Every aspect of daily life was designed to point toward mortality and salvation. The lay brothers, by contrast, were housed in the western range, physically separated from the choir monks by the entire width of the cloister. They entered the church through a separate door, worshipped in a separate section of the nave, and ate in a separate refectory. The division was absolute. 2 classes of men living under the same roof, serving the same God, governed by the same abbot, but occupying entirely different worlds. The water engineering was equally remarkable. The River Skell was channeled through the precinct in a series of controlled watercourses that provided drinking water, powered the corn mill, flushed the latrines, and drained the marshier sections of the valley. The corn mill, powered by the Skell's current, operated continuously from the 12th century until 1927, a span of nearly 800 years. Under its early abbots, Fountains grew quickly. The small stone church was built, the timber, claustral buildings were replaced, and the community attracted recruits and donations from wealthy patrons across the north. But it was the election of Henry Murdoch as abbot in 1143 that drew Fountains into the kind of political conflict that the founding monks had specifically tried to escape. Murdoch was not a contemplative, he was an operator. He had connections to St. Bernard of Clairvaux himself, and had previously commissioned a church at Vauclair Abbey in France. Under his leadership, the abbey's buildings were rapidly expanded. Within 3 years, an aisled nave had been added to the stone church, and the first permanent claustral buildings, built in stone and roofed in tile, had been completed. But Murdoch's real passion was ecclesiastical politics, and he had made a powerful enemy. William Fitzherbert, a nephew of King Stephen, had been appointed Archbishop of York in 1142. The Cistercians, led by Murdoch, opposed the appointment furiously. They accused Fitzherbert of simony, the buying and selling of church offices, and of unchaste living. Bernard of Clairvaux himself wrote to the Pope denouncing Fitzherbert in terms that have echoed through the centuries. He called Fitzherbert a man rotten from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. The abbots of both Fountains and Rievaulx joined a delegation to Rome in 1143 to argue for Fitzherbert's removal. The dispute consumed English church politics for years. Murdoch was not content to reform only Fountains. He saw the Cistercian order as a vehicle for reshaping the entire English church, and he pursued that vision with a single-mindedness that made him both admired and feared. The historian Glyn Coppac has traced the architectural similarities between Murdoch's church at Fountains and the church he had previously commissioned at Vauclair Abbey in France, suggesting that Murdoch brought a specific continental vision of what a Cistercian monastery should look like and imposed it on the English landscape. The buildings he commissioned were plain by the standards of other orders as Cistercian principles demanded, but they were also enormous. The message was clear. Simplicity did not mean modesty. The Cistercians could be austere and powerful at the same time. In 1146, the consequences of Murdoch's political interventions arrived at the gates of Fountains Abbey in the form of an angry mob. Fitzherbert's supporters, furious at Murdoch's role in blocking their candidate's appointment, attacked the abbey and set fire to the timber buildings. Everything burned except the stone church and a few surrounding structures. The contemporary record tells us that the abbey was damaged beyond repair and had to be rebuilt from the ground up. It was the worst disaster in the abbey's short history, and it was entirely self-inflicted. the direct result of an abbot who had decided that monastic politics mattered more than monastic peace. But the Cistercians were nothing if not resilient. The community recovered with remarkable speed, and Murdoch's gamble ultimately paid off. In 1147, the Cistercian Pope Eugenius III deposed Fitzherbert and installed Murdoch himself as Archbishop of York. Murdoch resigned the abbacy and moved to York, where he continued to meddle in the affairs of Fountains from a distance, even forcing one of his successors, an abbot named Thorold, to resign after just 2 years. The next abbot, a man called Richard, brought stability. He held the post for 20 years, from 1150 to 1170, and under his leadership, the abbey embarked on the massive building program that would produce most of the structures visible today. The damaged church was rebuilt on a larger scale, new accommodation was constructed for the growing community, and the chapter house was completed. By the time Richard died in 1170, Fountains had recovered from the attack and was on the path to becoming one of the wealthiest monasteries in England. The Archbishop, in after years, made amends for the excesses of his adherents and expressed his deep sorrow for what had occurred. But the damage was done, and the lesson of 1146 should have been clear. The abbey's greatest threats would always come not from the wilderness that surrounded it, but from the political entanglements of the men who led it. The founders had sought to escape the corruption of St. Mary's. Within 14 years, their successors had brought a different kind of corruption to the Skell Valley, the corruption of ambition, and the buildings had burned for it. The wealth that funded this construction came primarily from one source: wool. Fountains became the most productive wool producer among the Cistercian houses in the north of England, with only Rievaulx and Jervaulx approaching its output. The scale was industrial. 13 tons of fleece left the abbey every year, sorted, graded, and prepared by lay brothers in a dedicated wool house south of the River Skell. The buyers were not local merchants. They were Venetian and Florentine traders who came to Yorkshire specifically to purchase English wool for the textile workshops of Italy. The quality standards were extraordinary. In 1276, the abbey signed a contract with Florentine merchants to supply 62 sacks of wool with specifications so precise they read like a modern commodity agreement. No sheep's mark, no short clippings, no clotted wool, no black, no grey, no pelt wool. Each sack was weighed, inspected, and graded before export. A lay brother was specifically assigned to wool preparation on a designated acre of land at Dishforth. This was not a monastery producing surplus for charity. This was a commercial operation, exporting a luxury product across international markets. And wool was only part of the picture. The abbey, mined lead in the Yorkshire Dales, worked iron at on-site forges, quarried stone for commercial sale, and bred horses for the aristocratic market. Urban properties in York, Yarm, Grimsby, Scarborough, and Boston served as trading posts and warehouses for the abbey's sprawling commercial network. The estates were linked by a system of granges, outlying farms that functioned as staging posts and production centres across hundreds of miles of English countryside. The Italian merchants' presence in Yorkshire was part of a wider pattern of international commerce that connected the remote valleys of northern England to the great banking houses of Florence and Venice. The Bardi and Peruzzi families, two of the most powerful mercantile dynasties in medieval Italy, both traded in English wool, and the quality of the Cistercian product was legendary. According to a list compiled by the Florentine merchant Francesco Balducci Pegolotti at the end of the 13th century, the Cistercian houses of Yorkshire were consistently producing the highest quality wool in England, and Fountains, Rievaulx, and Jervaulx were the three most productive. The prices the Italian merchants were willing to pay reflected this quality. Cistercian wool commanded a premium over the output of non-Cistercian monasteries, and the Yorkshire abbeys were all in the top 20 producers listed by Pegolotti. The monks had become, without ever using the term, luxury brand manufacturers. By 1200, Fountains controlled at least 24 granges spread across Yorkshire, Lancashire, Lincolnshire, and the Lake District. The average grange contained between 300 and 400 arable acres, but some were much larger. The total acreage, including pasture, woodland, and meadow, could exceed 1,000 acres per grange. The Abbey's estates eventually encompassed holdings in roughly 140 villages, and Fountains did not merely accumulate wealth, it exported its entire system. Daughter houses were established at Sawley, Roche, Woburn, Mow, Kirkstall, and Vandy, each one replicating the Fountains model of choir monks for prayer and lay brothers for production. In 1146, a colony of monks was even sent to Bergen in Norway, extending the Fountains network across the North Sea. Kirkstall Abbey, near Leeds, founded from Fountains in 1152, became one of the best preserved Cistercian ruins in England, and its remains stand to this day as proof of how thoroughly the mother house propagated its economic and architectural DNA. The wealth funded construction at Fountains that is still difficult to comprehend. The Abbey Church, rebuilt after the 1146 attack, eventually stretched 300 feet with 11 bays in the side aisles. A lantern tower was added at the crossing in the late 12th century. In the early 13th century, the choir was dramatically extended under 3 successive abbots, John of York, John of Hessel, and John of Kent, who between them managed an expansion program lasting more than 40 years. The result was a vast eastern transept called the Chapel of the Nine Altars, modelled on a similar arrangement at Durham Cathedral. Its windows were cut so high and wide that the space seems to dissolve into light, even without glass. The cloister was lined with arcading of black marble from Nidderdale set against white sandstone. An infirmary was built for the sick and elderly. Guest houses were constructed for lay visitors, positioned carefully outside the monastic enclosure so that the Cistercian prohibition on outsiders entering the sacred spaces was maintained. At its peak, in the mid-13th century, the Abbey precinct covered 70 acres, surrounded by an 11-foot wall built in the 13th century, sections of which are still visible to the south and west of the ruins. The precinct was divided into 3 concentric zones by the River Skell. The central zone contained the church and claustral buildings. The inner court, stretching down to the river, housed the domestic buildings, the kitchens, the bakehouse, the brewhouse, and the abbot's lodging. The outer court, south of the river, contained the industrial and agricultural buildings, the wool house, the tannery, the watermills, the granary, and the workshops where lay brothers and hired servants carried out the trades that sustained the Abbey's commercial empire. The church itself was one of the longest in England, its 300-foot nave terminating in the east with the Chapel of the Nine Altars, a transept arrangement inspired by Durham Cathedral that created a vast wall of light at the building's most sacred end. The windows of the chapel were filled with stained glass depicting scenes from Scripture, and the altars were dedicated to different saints, each one funded by a patron whose family expected the monks to pray for their souls in perpetuity. This was the economy of salvation. Land and money flowed in, prayers flowed out, and the abbey grew richer with every generation of patrons who believed that their eternal fate depended on the intercession of men who had renounced the world. The guest houses, positioned west of the Lay Brothers Range, were designed to accommodate wealthy visitors without violating the Cistercian prohibition on outsiders entering the monastic enclosure. The abbey was not merely a monastery. It was a small city, self-contained, self-governed, and self-financing, with its own legal jurisdiction and its own system of justice. The abbey's wealth also enabled genuine acts of compassion. Abbot Ralph Haggett, who had entered Fountains at the age of 30 as a novice after pursuing a military career, presided over the monastery during the Great European Famine of 1194. For 6 months, the abbey distributed food, shelter, and spiritual care to crowds of starving people who gathered at its gates. The infirmary was overwhelmed, and temporary shelters had to be erected to accommodate the sick. This was real charity on a scale that few institutions in 12th century England could match. But it was funded by the same system that kept lay brothers in silence and poverty while the abbey traded with the richest merchants in Europe. The contradiction was visible to everyone, and it was pointed out repeatedly by critics of the Cistercian order. The monks had fled St. Mary's seeking simplicity. Within a century, they were running what amounted to a multinational corporation. The lay brothers themselves had encouraged the expansion, pushing the monks to extend their estates far beyond what was necessary for self-sufficiency. By the middle of the 13th century, Fountains was one of England's richest religious houses. The men who had huddled around a fire in a wooden shelter on the 26th of December, 1132, wondering whether they would survive the winter, would not have recognized what their experiment had become. The decline began before the catastrophes. In the second half of the 13th century, the abbey became financially unstable, largely due to a practice that would be familiar to any modern commodities trader: forward selling. The monks were borrowing against future wool harvests, committing their clip to Italian merchants years in advance in exchange for cash up front. When harvests failed or prices dropped, the abbey was locked into contracts it could not fulfill. 11 abbots presided over the community in this period, a rate of turnover that suggests chronic instability at the top. When Archbishop John Roman visited the abbey in 1294, he was appalled. He criticized the dire material and physical state of the institution and demanded reforms. The abbey had committed itself to supplying wool that had not yet been grown to merchants who had already paid for it. When sheep disease struck, or Scottish raiders destroyed the flocks, the contracts could not be fulfilled, and the Italian merchants pursued their debts through both ecclesiastical and secular courts. The run of disasters that followed made reform impossible. Taxation increased steadily as England's wars demanded more revenue from its religious houses. William Grange, writing in his History of Fountains, noted that the taxation of the abbey's temporal goods fell from £343 in 1292 to £243 in 1318. Not because tax rates decreased, but because the abbey's estates had shrunk so dramatically that there was simply less to tax. Then came the 14th century, and it dismantled everything. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 was a military catastrophe for England, but for the monasteries of the north, it was an economic one. Robert the Bruce's victorious Scottish army swept south, looting and burning as far as York itself. The abbey's northern granges were raided, livestock was stolen, buildings were torched, and entire communities of lay brothers and tenant farmers were scattered. Edward II exempted the monks from all taxation in 1319 because the damage was so severe, but the raids continued sporadically for decades. Then came the bad harvests, a series of crop failures in the early 14th century that pushed much of northern England into famine. And then came the Black Death. The plague arrived in Yorkshire in 1349 and killed roughly a third of the population within 18 months. At Fountains, the effect was devastating. The lay brother system, which had powered the abbey's rise over 2 centuries, collapsed. There were simply not enough men willing to take vows of poverty and silence in exchange for a life of agricultural labour on a remote Yorkshire grange when the population had been cut by a third and wages for free labourers were rising. The conversi could not be replaced. The granges were leased to tenant farmers who had no spiritual obligation to the abbey and whose primary concern was their own survival. Hired servants replaced the lay brothers in the abbey itself, quartered in the outer court south of the River Skell rather than in the cellarium. In 1363, Fountains petitioned its mother house at Clairvaux for permission to convert its ruined granges into villages and farm them out entirely to secular tenants. The granges at Aldborough, Slenningford, Sutton, Cowton, Caton, Bramley, Bradley, Kilnsey and Thorpe were described in the petition as perished, burnt and reduced to nothing by the wars of the Scotch and English. The Golden Age was over. During the plague years, the poor flocked to Fountains seeking help and care. The infirmary was overwhelmed and could not accommodate everyone. Temporary shelters had to be erected outside the abbey walls to house the sick and dying. The monks themselves were not immune. The community shrank as brothers died or fled, and the careful administrative systems that had sustained the abbey's commercial operations for 2 centuries began to break down. Records were lost or abandoned. Contracts went unfulfilled. The elaborate network of granges that had stretched from the Lake District to Lincolnshire contracted to a handful of tenant farms within a few miles of the abbey. The system that had made Fountains the richest Cistercian house in England had been broken by plague, war, climate, and the simple human refusal to accept a life of silence and unpaid labour when better options existed. The lay brothers who had built Fountains' wealth were gone, and they would never be replaced. The Great Papal Schism of 1378 severed the institutional link that had connected Fountains to its mother house at Citeaux since the founding. The English Cistercian abbots were ordered to break off all contact with the French mother house and form their own chapter, descending into decades of internecine politics. The 15th century brought no relief. In 1410, the death of Abbot Robert Burley triggered a succession crisis that lasted 5 years and tore the community apart. A monk named Roger Frank was initially appointed as Burley's successor, but he was immediately challenged by John Ropin, abbot of the Cistercian house at Meaux. Frank was expelled and Ropin installed, but only after protracted legal battles that reached Parliament itself. Ropin petitioned in 1414 for the restoration of property that Frank had allegedly appropriated during his brief tenure. The dispute was not resolved until 1416, when Ropin was finally confirmed as abbot. He ruled until his death in 1434, and what followed was a period of fragile recovery. Abbot John Greenwell, who served from 1442 to 1471, managed to reduce the abbey's debts by 1,000 marks and began to restore some semblance of financial order. But during his abbacy, a monk named William Downham tried to poison him. Greenwell survived, but the attempt revealed how far the community had fallen from the ideals that had driven the 13 dissenters out of St. Mary's 3 centuries earlier. This was no longer a house of prayer. It was a house of faction. In 1443, Sir John Neville was hauled before the Privy Council and charged to keep the peace after his men had been making a riot at the Abbey. The council warned Neville, on pain of £1,000, that neither by him, nor by his men, nor by their encouragement, should any harm in body or goods be done to the abbot, convent, or their servants. A commission was issued the following year against certain anonymous sons of iniquity who had infringed the liberties of the house. They were given 3 months to make restitution under pain of the greater excommunication. The monastery, that had once been powerful enough to trade with Florence, was now begging the state for protection from Yorkshire thugs. Abbot Thomas Swinton, who served from 1471 to 1478, kept a detailed memorandum book that provides exceptional insight into the daily administration of the abbey during this difficult period. His successor, John Darnton, continued the work of restoration, undertaking significant repairs to the fabric of the church. The last great abbot was Marmaduke Bradley. He served from 1495 to 1526, and against all odds, he transformed Fountains from a declining, debt-ridden institution into something resembling its former glory. He expanded the number of monks from 22 to 52, a remarkable achievement during a period when most English monasteries were contracting. He extended the infirmary, invested in the abbey's buildings, and oversaw a final burst of construction that produced the most recognizable feature of the ruins today, the tower. Huber's Tower rises 160 feet from the north transept, built in the perpendicular Gothic style that was fashionable in the late 15th century. Its position is unusual, attached to the transept rather than the crossing, which makes it visible for miles across the Skell Valley and gives it a quality of isolation, as if it stands slightly apart from the abbey it was meant to complete. Hubie inscribed it with his personal motto, Soli Deo honor et gloria. To God alone be honour and glory. It was the last significant construction at Fountains Abbey. Hubie died in 1526, and within 13 years of his death, every monk would be gone. Hubie also kept the abbey politically connected. He sat in Parliament as one of the abbots entitled to a seat in the House of Lords, and he maintained relationships with powerful families across the north. He was, in many ways, the last medieval abbot, a man who understood that spiritual authority and temporal power were inseparable and who exercised both with equal facility. His building programme was not merely an act of vanity, it was a statement of intent. The tower, visible from miles around, announced to the world that Fountains Abbey was still alive, still relevant, still powerful. It was a bluff, of course. The abbey's underlying finances were fragile. Its community was smaller than it had been in centuries, and the political winds in England were shifting in directions that no amount of perpendicular stonework could resist. But for 31 years, Hubie maintained the illusion. The tower would outlast them all, and it stands today as a monument to the last man who believed Fountains Abbey could still be saved. Hubie's successor was William Thirsk, and what happened to Thirsk is one of the ugliest betrayals in the Abbey's 400-year history. Thirsk was educated at Oxford and had graduated in 1523. He was elected abbot in 1526, the same year that Hubie died. Almost immediately, he found himself in the crosshairs of Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's newly appointed Vicar General, who had been tasked with surveying every monastery in England. Cromwell's agents, Richard Leighton and Thomas Ledge, were notorious. They arrived with 86 questions designed to find evidence of moral and financial failure, and they were not interested in nuance. The questions ranged from whether divine service was properly maintained to whether monks kept company with women within or without the monastery, whether any of the brethren were incorrigible, and whether there were any boys lying with them. The questions were not designed to help the monasteries improve. They were designed to produce ammunition. Do they wear their religious habit continually and never leave it off, but when they go to bed? Do any of the brethren have boys lying by them? Is the abbot incorrigible? The language was loaded, the investigations cursory, and the conclusions predetermined. Leighton and Ledge moved through the monasteries of the north like auditors looking for a reason to close a business, and they found what they were looking for at Fountains. The intention was not to reform, it was to justify dissolution. Thirsk was accused of theft, sacrilege, selling the abbey's valuables, wasting its estates, and keeping 6 mistresses. The Earl of Northumberland himself wrote to Cardinal Wolsey complaining of Thirsk's bad rule. Whether these charges were true, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated by men with a financial interest in the abbey's destruction remains debated by historians to this day. What is not debated is what happened next. Thirsk was stripped of the abbacy on the 20th of January 1536 by Leighton and Legge, who accused him of incontinence and theft, called him an idiot, and promised him a pension of 100 marks. He was replaced by Marmaduke Bradley, a monk of Fountains, who had reported Thirsk's supposed offences, testified against him at the inquiry, and then offered the crown 600 marks to buy the position for himself. Bradley got what he paid for. One of the commissioners described him approvingly as a right apt man for the post. Thirsk, meanwhile, retired to Rievaulx Abbey, humiliated and stripped of everything. He might have lived out his days there in obscurity, but history intervened. In the autumn of 1536, a lawyer named Robert Aske raised an army in Yorkshire to defend the monasteries. The rebels were joined by priests carrying crosses and banners, and their march to York, which at its peak numbered over 30,000 people, became known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. It was the largest popular uprising in English history since the Peasants' Revolt. The Pilgrimage of Grace was not a peasant uprising. It was a broad coalition that included parish priests, local gentry, and even members of the aristocracy who believed that Henry's dissolution of the monasteries was an assault on the social and spiritual fabric of northern England. The monasteries were not just religious houses. They were hospitals, schools, employers, landlords, and welfare providers. Their dissolution would leave a hole in the social infrastructure of the north that would not be filled for centuries. Thirsk joined the rebels, partly out of conviction and partly, it seems, out of hope that the rebellion might restore him to Fountain. The Abbot of Rievaulx's involvement suggests he was at least partly persuaded by others who saw in the former abbot a useful figurehead. It did not. Henry VIII initially agreed to negotiate, then broke his promises and ordered reprisals. A second, smaller uprising, led by Francis Bigod in early 1537, gave Henry the pretext he needed. Bigod's army was easily defeated, and in the aftermath, Thirsk was arrested. He was tried for treason and hanged at Tyburn in June 1537. The man who had betrayed him, Marmaduke Bradley, sat comfortably in the abbot's chair for 2 more years, collecting his salary and watching as the institutional machinery of dissolution ground steadily toward Fountains. On the 26th of November, 1539, Marmaduke Bradley signed the deed of surrender. The document itself has not survived, but the pension records have. Bradley received £100 a year, a sum that would have made him comfortable for the rest of his life. The prior, Thomas Kidd, received £8. Each of the 30 remaining monks received between £5 and £6, 13 shillings and 4p. 4 centuries of prayer, labour, and accumulated wealth were dissolved in a single afternoon. For a brief moment, there had been a plan to save the abbey. Henry's administrators had drawn up a detailed scheme to convert Fountains into a cathedral for a new bishopric, covering the Archdeaconry of Richmond, with jurisdiction extending into Lancashire. The staffing plan was remarkably specific: a bishop, a dean, 6 prebendaries, 6 minor canons, choristers, and masters of both the grammar school and the song school. Salaries were calculated. The total cost, including allowances for tenths and first fruits, came to £669, 13 shillings and 9p. Together with the pensions already promised to the monks, this would have nearly exhausted the abbey's clear annual revenue of £998. The scheme was abandoned. Chester Abbey received the new bishopric instead. Fountains Abbey, the only Cistercian house in England considered for such an honour, was handed over to the asset strippers. The irony of the proposed Fountains bishopric is almost unbearable. The abbey that had been targeted for dissolution because it was supposedly corrupt and inadequate was simultaneously considered worthy of elevation to one of the most prestigious positions in the English Church. The truth, of course, was that the dissolution had never been about morality. It had been about money. Henry's break with Rome had created a financial crisis, and the wealth of the monasteries, estimated at roughly 1/3 of all the land in England, was the only asset large enough to fill the gap. Fountains, with its annual revenue of nearly £1,000, was one of the richest prizes. The moral justifications provided by Cromwell's commissioners were a convenience, not a cause. The monks knew this. Bradley knew this, and he signed the surrender anyway. What was lost in the dissolution was not merely a building or an income stream, it was an entire social infrastructure. The abbey had provided employment, directly and indirectly, to hundreds of people across the north of England. It had maintained roads, bridges, and watercourses. It had offered hospitality to travellers and charity to the poor. It had educated boys in its grammar school and trained singers in its song school. It had maintained a library that preserved manuscripts dating back centuries. It had provided medical care through its infirmary and spiritual care through its guest houses. All of this disappeared in November 1539 and none of it was replaced. The dissolution of the monasteries was presented by the Crown as a moral reformation, a cleaning of the Augean stables of religious corruption. In practice, it was the largest act of institutional vandalism in English history, and Fountains Abbey, the richest Cistercian house in the country, was one of its greatest victims. The Crown sold the Abbey buildings and 500 acres of land on the 1st of October 1540 to Sir Richard Gresham, a London merchant who had previously served as Lord Mayor and as a Member of Parliament. This was the same Richard Gresham who had supplied Cardinal Wolsey with the tapestries for his new residence at Hampton Court, and who had paid for the Cardinal's funeral. His connection to the old religious order made his treatment of fountains all the more pointed. Gresham's interest in the Abbey was not architectural, and it was not sentimental. It was financial. Furnaces were built inside the Abbey church, in the very nave where monks had celebrated Mass for 4 centuries, to melt the lead from the roof and the pipes. The fire was fed with timber ripped from the choir screens and furnishings. The stained glass, which had filled the great windows of the Chapel of the 9 Altars with depictions of salvation and damnation, was pulled from its frames and carted to Ripon and York for resale. The bells were taken down. Today's visitors can see the holes in the masonry where lead piping once ran, the sockets and corbels where timbers once rested, and the empty spaces where glass stood for 4 centuries before being carted away in wagons. The doors were removed and later found being used as flooring in the nearby corn mill, the only surviving Cistercian corn mill in England, which had been grinding grain for the Abbey since the 12th century and would continue operating under secular ownership until 1927, when it finally ceased production. It was completely restored in 2001 and can be visited today. The great nave, stripped of its roof, stood open to the rain. The cloister, with its black marble and white sandstone arcading, began to weather. The cellarium, somehow, survived. Its vaulted ceiling, built to support the weight of 140 sleeping lay brothers, proved too solid to be worth dismantling for scrap. Gresham's son Thomas, who would go on to found the Royal Exchange in London, sold the estate in 1597 to Sir Stephen Proctor, a Protestant magistrate who brought a new kind of violence to the ruins. Proctor was an ironmaster's son who had risen through the local magistracy and was consumed by reforming zeal. He pursued Jesuit priests with a fervour that terrified the conservative Yorkshire gentry, raiding Catholic households and prosecuting recusants with the kind of energy that made him universally despised. He turned his attention to the Abbey ruins with the same ruthlessness. He flattened the abbot's house, which had stood in the precipitous shade of the wooded valley's southern slope, and recycled its stone to build Fountains Hall on the sunnier northern side. The Elizabethan mansion still stands today, a handsome building in the Tudor style that visitors pass on their way to the ruins, though few realise that its walls contain the dressed stone of a medieval abbot's residence. Some of the Abbey buildings were probably repurposed for industrial use. Evidence of metalworking has been found in the vicinity of the warming house chimney, which may have been reused as a furnace flue. Deposits of coal and raw materials have been discovered nearby. Proctor himself did not last long. His zealotry made him so many enemies that he was eventually driven from the district, imprisoned for debt, and forgotten. The estate passed to the Messenger family, who owned it from 1627 to 1767, and did relatively little to either preserve or further damage the ruins. For 140 years, Fountains Abbey stood in a kind of suspended decay, slowly succumbing to weather, gravity, and the occasional farmer who pried loose a stone for a field wall. Ivy crept over the arches, trees grew through the nave floor. The great east window of the Chapel of the 9 Altars, once filled with coloured glass depicting scenes of salvation, stood open to the rain, like a frame with no painting in it. For nearly 200 years after Proctor's departure, the ruins of Fountains Abbey existed in a state of suspended animation. The Messenger family, who owned the estate from 1627 to 1767, were not builders or destroyers. They were custodians of a kind, though their custodianship amounted to little more than benign neglect. The abbey crumbled slowly. Rain found its way into the mortar. Frost cracked the stones. Vegetation colonized every available surface. Trees grew through the floor of the nave, their roots splitting the flagstones and their branches reaching toward the sky where the roof had once been. The great east window of the Chapel of the Nine Altars, stripped of its glass 5 centuries earlier, became a frame through which the changing seasons could be observed with a clarity that no intact building could match. Artists began to visit. The Romantic movement, which swept through European culture in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, turned medieval ruins into objects of aesthetic and emotional value, the very qualities that made Fountains a site of destruction. Its roofless walls, its empty windows, its vast scale reduced to fragments, became the qualities that made it beautiful. The ruin was no longer a failure, it was a landscape, a mood, a meditation on time and impermanence. Fountains appeared in prints and paintings, in travel accounts and guidebooks, in the sketchbooks of artists who came to the Skell Valley to capture something that no intact building could provide, the visible evidence of human ambition defeated by time. It was into this cultural moment that John Aislabie arrived, and it was this sensibility that he exploited with such genius. Then John Aislabie found the ruins, or rather, he found the view. Aislabie was born on the 4th of December 1670, the son of a Yorkshire yeoman farmer named George Aislabie, who had married spectacularly above his station. George's wife was Mary Mallory, daughter of Sir John Mallory of Studley Royal, one of the oldest landed families in the county. The marriage did not end well. George's presumption in marrying into the gentry was a source of gossip and resentment, and in 1675 it led directly to his death. A man named Jonathan Jennings insulted George at a public gathering, calling him the scum of the county. A duel followed, and George Aislabie was killed. John was 5 years old. He inherited the Studley royal estate from his mother's family in 1693 and entered Parliament as MP for Ripon 2 years later at the age of 25. His political career was characterized by ambition, flexibility, and an instinct for aligning himself with whoever held power. He was classed as a Tory early on, switched to the Whigs when it suited him, served as a Lord of the Admiralty, then as Treasurer of the Navy, and by 1718 he had risen to the second most powerful financial position in the country, Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was described by the Speaker of the House as a dark and cunning man, suspected and low in all men's opinion, though also a man of good understanding and very capable of business. He allied himself with the Earl of Sunderland, who became in effect Prime Minister in 1718, and Sunderland repaid Aislabie's loyalty by appointing him Chancellor of the Exchequer. It was the summit of a political career built on opportunism, and it would be destroyed within 2 years. It was in this role that Aislabie became one of the principal architects of the most catastrophic financial scandal in British history before the modern era. The South Sea Company had been founded in 1711 as a public-private partnership designed to consolidate the national debt. On paper, it was a financial instrument. In practice, its commercial engine was the Asiento, a monopoly contract granted by Spain under the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 that gave Britain the exclusive right to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies in the Americas. The contract was specific: 4,800 human beings per year for 30 years. 2/3 were to be male, 90% were to be adults. They were to be transported from the African coast to ports including Cartagena, Buenos Aires, Veracruz, Havana, Caracas, Portobello, and Santiago de Cuba, where they would be sorted, inspected, and sold to Spanish colonists who needed labor for mines and plantations. Over its entire trading lifetime, the South Sea Company forced nearly 42,000 people onto ships leaving the African coast. Just over 35,000 survived the crossing. The rest, more than 7,000 men, women, and children, died at sea. Their bodies were thrown to the sharks. The economic historian Helen Paul has noted that these facts are at odds with the contemporary satires and entertainments about the company, none of which dealt with the horrors of the trade. The South Sea Bubble, as it is remembered in British financial history, is treated as a story about greed, speculation, and the madness of crowds. The enslaved people, who were the company's primary commodity, are rarely mentioned. Aislaby was not merely a passive beneficiary of this system, he was its parliamentary champion. When in 1719 the South Sea Company proposed a deal to take over the entire national debt in exchange for government bonds, Aislaby negotiated the contract and personally piloted the bill through the House of Commons. He was described by the Speaker of the House as a dark, cunning man, suspected and low in all men's opinion, though the Speaker also acknowledged that Aislaby was a man of good understanding and very capable of business. The South Sea Company's stock price soared as speculation drove it far beyond any realistic valuation. Aislaby himself speculated heavily, purchasing £20,000 in company stock before the bill's passage. When the bubble burst in August 1720, thousands of ordinary investors across England were ruined. A parliamentary investigation found that Aislaby had been given the stock in exchange for his promotion of the scheme. In March 1721, the Commons passed a series of resolutions without a single dissenting vote, declaring him guilty of the most notorious, dangerous, and infamous corruption. Even his allies sat, as one contemporary observer recorded, mute as fishes. Aislaby was expelled from the House, removed from the Privy Council, and imprisoned in the Tower of London. A bill was prepared to freeze and confiscate his assets. In the end, thanks to the intervention of Robert Walpole, he was allowed to keep everything he had owned before becoming Chancellor, which amounted to £119,000 out of a total fortune of £164,000. He was declared incapable of sitting in Parliament or holding any public office for the rest of his life, and so John Aislaby returned to Yorkshire. He was disgraced, but he was still one of the richest men in the county. He was banned from public life, but not from private ambition. And he had something that most exiled politicians did not: unlimited time, vast resources, and a landscape. He had actually begun transforming Studley Royal as early as 1716, when a fire damaged the medieval manor house, and he used the opportunity to rebuild. The first phase of serious garden work began in 1718, the same year he became Chancellor, with the construction of a formal canal along the River Skell and a tower on How Hill as an eye-catcher. But it was his disgrace that turned a hobby into an obsession. From 1723 onward, Aislaby devoted himself entirely to the creation of one of the most ambitious designed landscapes in European history. He redirected the River Skell into a canal built for beauty, not commerce. He carved moon-shaped ponds into the valley floor, so perfectly circular that they reflected the sky like polished mirrors. He constructed classical temples at strategic viewpoints along the ridgeline, each one positioned to offer a specific vista to visitors approaching along carefully designed carriage paths. He built a neo-Gothic castle on one crest, an octagonal tower on another, and the Temple of Piety in the valley, whose acoustics were so perfect that musicians could perform while guests sat listening across the water. He built a serpentine tunnel that emerged at a point along the ridge where, suddenly and without warning, the visitor was confronted with a view he called Surprise View. There, far below through the trees, the ruins of Fountains Abbey rose from the valley floor. Aislaby wanted the abbey. He tried to buy it from the Messenger family. They refused. So he stole the view instead, framing 400 years of Cistercian architecture as a decorative feature in the pleasure garden of a man who had been convicted of promoting a company that shipped 42,000 people across the Atlantic in chains. The garden was open to respectable visitors from almost the beginning. In the 18th century, small parties of guests would arrive by carriage and be led along the paths by servants carrying refreshments. Each folly and viewpoint was designed to provoke a specific emotional response, from the mathematical serenity of the moon pond to the theatrical shock of surprise view. The Temple of Piety, positioned in the valley floor, was modelled on a drawing by Palladio from Lord Burlington's own collection, and may have been suggested as a design by Burlington himself. The architecture of the garden was a catalogue of the classical education and social connections that Aislaby had accumulated during his years in power. Even in disgrace, he moved in the orbit of the greatest architects and tastemakers of the Georgian age. Aislaby died on the 18th of June 1742, still in exile, still building, still refining the garden that had consumed the last 2 decades of his life. His son William took over both the estate and the obsession. William had entered Parliament in his father's old seat at Ripon, and would eventually serve long enough to become Father of the House, the longest-serving member. The family's disgrace, it seemed, did not transfer between generations. William continued his father's work in the gardens, extending the designed landscape into the eastern Skell Valley and adding the 7 Bridges walk. And in 1767, he finally achieved what his father had spent years attempting. He purchased the Fountains Abbey estate from the Messenger family for £18,000 and incorporated the ruins fully into the Studley royal landscape. The sacred became the scenic. A monastery where men had taken vows of silence was now a conversation piece for dinner guests arriving by carriage to admire the Moon Pond. William commissioned further excavation of the ruins, clearing debris and vegetation to reveal the architecture beneath. He landscaped the approach so that visitors would encounter the abbey in the most dramatic way possible, emerging from the designed garden into the raw grandeur of the medieval stonework. The contrast was deliberate. The garden represented order, reason, and human control. The ruins represented time, decay, and the failure of even the most powerful institutions to endure. Together, they created a landscape that was both beautiful and melancholic, and visitors came in large numbers to experience it. The work of father and son spanned more than 60 years, and the garden as visitors see it today is largely as William left it when he died in 1781. It was, by any standard, one of the most remarkable achievements of 18th century landscape design, that it was conceived and executed by a family whose patriarch had been imprisoned for corruption and whose fortune derived, in part, from the profits of the transatlantic slave trade, was a detail that the carriage parties preferred not to discuss. When William Aislaby died in 1781, the estate passed to his daughter Elizabeth Allenson, and then, through several hands, to the Robinson family. George Robinson, the first Marquess of Ripon, married Henrietta Viner in 1851 and added significant features to the estate, including a deer park that still contains over 500 red, fallow, and sika deer. But the most remarkable addition came from tragedy. In 1870, Frederick Viner, Henrietta's brother, and the first Marquess's brother-in-law, was kidnapped by Greek bandits while travelling near Athens. A ransom was gathered, but before it could be delivered, Viner was murdered. His mother, Lady Mary Viner, and his sister, Lady Ripon, used the unspent ransom money to build 2 memorial churches on their respective Yorkshire estates. The architect they chose was William Burgess, one of the most extraordinary figures in Victorian Gothic design. St Mary's at Studley Royal, consecrated in 1878, is positioned on an avenue aligned with the west front of Ripon Cathedral. Its interior is a riot of polished marble, mosaics, gilding, and stained glass of extraordinary quality. The architectural historian Nicolaus Pevsner called it a Victorian shrine, a dream of early English glory. Burgess himself considered it his ecclesiastical masterpiece. The first Marquess of Ripon also introduced the admission fee, first charged in 1853, a shilling per visitor, which acknowledged what had been true for decades. Fountains Abbey was no longer a ruin, that happened to be visited. It was a tourist attraction. The estate reportedly welcomed around 30,000 people for the consecration of St. Mary's in 1878, a visitor number that few rural attractions in England could match at the time. The Marquess also oversaw the transformation of the estate from a private pleasure ground into something approaching a public attraction, charging the first admission fee, 1 shilling, in 1853. The first floodlighting of the Abbey ruins came in 1932, initiated by the Viner family to mark the 800th anniversary of the founding. The lights proved so popular that a permanent installation followed, enabling evening visits that transformed the ruins into something closer to a theatrical set than an archaeological site. But the 20th century was not kind to the estate's private owners. When the second Marquess of Ripon died in 1923, the estate passed to his cousin, Clare George Viner. The Viner family refurbished Fountains Hall as their home and gave over Studley Royal House, the magnificent Palladian mansion that John Aislabie had rebuilt after the 1716 fire, to other uses. During the Second World War, the house was occupied by Queen Ethelburga's School, a girls' school evacuated from Harrogate. The building's wartime history was a mixture of schoolgirl hijinks, skating in the water garden and cocoa in the dormitories, and genuine tragedy. 2 of the Viner family's 3 children, Charles and Elizabeth, were killed during the war. A memorial dedicated to them by the Queen Mother stands on the estate to this day. Then, on the night of the 14th of April, 1946, just days after Queen Ethelburga's School had vacated the building and returned to Harrogate, Studley Royal House caught fire and burned to the ground. The cause was never definitively established. The Viner family, already devastated by the loss of their children, could not afford to rebuild. The magnificent house that John Aislabie had constructed from the ashes of his political disgrace was itself reduced to ashes. Only the Georgian stable block survived, built between 1728 and 1732 to house Aislabie's racehorses. It was a Palladian masterpiece in its own right, with distinctive pavilion towers at each corner and a working clock tower over the central courtyard, designed by Roger Morris with advice from the architect Colin Campbell on his deathbed. The Viners converted it into a private residence and retreated behind its walls. The school's wartime occupation of Studley Royal House was part of a broader pattern of requisitioning that saw many of England's great houses turned over to military or civilian use during the conflict. Queen Ethelburga's buildings in Harrogate had been taken over for top-secret code-breaking work, and the school needed alternative accommodation urgently. The Viner family, who were deeply patriotic, gave over not only Studley Royal House, but also the old stable block and much of Fountains Hall to the school. For 6 years, the sound of schoolgirls replaced the silence that had characterized the estate since the monks left in 1539. Then, the fire destroyed everything. The dramatic postscript, as one historian described it, closed a chapter that had begun when John Aislabie first walked into the Skell Valley 3 centuries earlier. In 1966, Henry Viner sold the estate to West Riding County Council. In 1983, the National Trust acquired the property from North Yorkshire County Council, and in 1986, UNESCO designated the entire landscape a World Heritage Site under the title Studley Royal Park, including the ruins of Fountains Abbey. The Abbey ruins are maintained by English Heritage under a guardianship agreement. The corn mill was restored and reopened. The visitor centre, built in 1992, was designed to reduce congestion in the historic core. The estate now welcomes more than 500,000 visitors per year. The conservation of the ruins is an ongoing challenge. The stone is porous and absorbs moisture, which freezes in winter and cracks the masonry from within. Vegetation must be carefully managed. The cellarium's bat population is protected by law, and the floodlighting schedule is adjusted seasonally to minimize disturbance. The ruins that survived the dissolution, the industrial stripping, the quarrying, the neglect, and the landscaping now face a threat that no medieval abbot could have imagined the slow, patient erosion of a changing climate on 800-year-old stone. The National Trust's own records now acknowledge what the Aislabi family never discussed during their lifetime, that the South Sea Company was created principally to supply enslaved people to work on Spanish plantations in the Americas, and that the Water Garden at Studley Royal was designed and built by a man whose political career was funded by the profits of that trade. Today, visitors approach Fountains Abbey through the Water Garden, exactly as Aislabi intended 3 centuries ago. They pass the moon ponds and the classical statues, walk through the surprise view, and emerge into the valley where the ruins rise from the grass like the skeleton of something enormous. The cellarium is still there, its vaulted ceiling now home to those 8 species of bat, including a breeding colony of Darbenton's bats that have adapted their behaviour to cope with the regular floodlighting. Hubie's tower still stands at 160 feet, his motto still legible if you know where to look. The corn mill still has the abbey's original doors as flooring, repurposed 5 centuries ago and still in place. And the ground-penetrating radar survey of 2016, conducted by a partnership between the National Trust, the University of Bradford, and several specialist survey firms, found several hundred graves in the monks' cemetery, arranged in careful and orderly rows. The dead of 9 centuries lying undisturbed beneath the lawns where tourists spread their picnic blankets and children chase each other between the gravestones they do not know are there. Since 2006, assessment of the impact of climate change has been an essential requirement for the management of World Heritage Sites, and Fountains is no exception. The same water that powered the monks' mills and flushed their latrines now poses a flooding risk to the ruins. The river Skell, which the medieval engineers channeled with such precision, periodically overwhelms the culverts and watercourses and floods the cellarium. Conservation teams work constantly to balance the competing demands of preservation, public access, and environmental change. The ruins that survived the dissolution, the industrial stripping, the quarrying, the neglect, and the landscaping now face a threat that no medieval abbot could have imagined: the slow, patient erosion of a changing climate on 800-year-old stone. The question that hangs over all of it is the same question that hangs over every property in this series. Who does this place belong to? To the 13 monks who were thrown out of York and nearly froze to death in a thornfield because they believed poverty was the path to God. To the lay brothers who sheared the sheep and mined the lead and slept on straw that was changed once a year while the institution they served grew rich enough to trade with Florence. To the abbot who was hanged at Tyburn for joining a rebellion against the king who destroyed his monastery. Or to the one who betrayed him and signed away 4 centuries of sacred history for a pension of £100. To the king who dissolved it, the merchant who built furnaces in the nave to melt its roof, the magistrate who stole its stones to build his own house. To the disgraced chancellor who looked at the corpse of a monastery and saw the most beautiful object in England, framing it at the end of a garden paid for with the wreckage of a company that had shipped 42,000 human beings across the Atlantic in chains. To the family who funded a masterpiece of Victorian Gothic architecture with the unspent ransom of a murdered man. Every layer of beauty at Fountains conceals a layer of exploitation. The abbey's wool wealth depended on conversi who could not speak. The garden's elegance depended on a financial scheme that shipped human beings in chains, and the estate's survival into the 20th century depended on admission fees charged to tourists who came to admire the view without asking who paid for it. To the National Trust, which charges admission and maintains a tea room and a gift shop in the visitor centre, or to no one at all. Perhaps a ruin belongs to no one. Perhaps that is the point. The monks sought poverty and built an empire. The politicians sought beauty and framed a corpse. And the abbey, roofless and open to the rain for nearly 500 years, remains the most beautiful building most people will ever walk through. It has outlasted every person who ever tried to own it. Every generation has found in fountains what it was looking for. The monks found God, or at least they found a system that allowed them to pursue God while accumulating the wealth of nations. The Tudors found money. The Elizabethans found building material. The Georgians found beauty. The Victorians found romance. The modern visitor finds a day out, a picnic site, a photograph for social media, a sense of awe that the brochure promised and the ruins deliver. But beneath all of these layers, beneath the National Trust signage and the gift shop and the admission fee and the carefully maintained lawns, the original question persists. 13 men walked into a frozen valley on the 26th of December, 1132, because they believed that poverty was sacred and wealth was corruption. Within a century, their successors had built one of the richest institutions in England. Within 4 centuries, it was destroyed by a king who needed the money. Within 5 centuries, it was being used as a garden ornament by a convicted fraud. And today, nearly 9 centuries after those 13 men arrived in the snow, 500,000 people a year walk through what remains and feel something they cannot quite name. It might be beauty. It might be grief. It might be the recognition that all human institutions, no matter how powerful or how beautiful, are temporary, and that the only thing that endures is the stone itself, standing open to the sky, waiting for the next generation to decide what it means. That may be the darkest story of all.